The morning air was crisp as Elena stood across the street from the Grandmont Concert Hall, staring up at its massive glass doors. She'd walked past this building 100 times before, always on her way to one job or another, but today was different. Today she was actually going inside. Well, she was going to try. In her hands, she held a manila folder that had seen better days. The corners were bent, and there was a coffee stain on the back from last Tuesday when she'd fallen asleep at her kitchen table, exhausted after a double shift. Inside the folder was her application for the Rising Stars competition, a stack of papers that represented every hope she'd carried for the past 4 years. Elena was 26 years old, and she'd only touched her first piano when she was 22. Most of the people who performed at places like Grandmont had been playing since they were 5 or 6, their parents paying for expensive lessons and fancy instruments. Elena had learned on a donated keyboard in the basement of a community center, squeezing in practice time between her morning shift at the diner and her evening shift at the coffee shop. But she'd fallen in love with music in a way that surprised even herself. Every chord, every melody felt like a language she'd been waiting her whole life to speak. Her teacher, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen who volunteered at the community center, told her she had something special. Not perfect technique, not the polish of formal training, but something real, something that made people stop and listen. Elena took a deep breath and crossed the street. The doors were heavier than she expected, and when she stepped inside, the sudden quiet made her heart skip. The lobby was all marble floors and crystal chandeliers, the kind of place where even your footsteps felt too loud. A woman at the reception desk looked up with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She took in Elena's worn jacket and the folder with its coffee stain, and something shifted in her expression. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone suggesting she doubted it. "I'm here to submit an application," Elena said, trying to keep her voice steady. "For the foundation grant. It's for the Rising Stars competition." The receptionist held out her hand and Elena passed over the folder like she was handing over something precious, which in a way she was. Inside that folder was a recording she'd made on her phone, a personal essay she'd rewritten 17 times, and letters of recommendation from Mrs. Chen and the manager at the diner, who'd noticed Elena humming complicated melodies while she refilled coffee cups. "You can have a seat," the receptionist said, gesturing vaguely toward a row of sleek leather chairs. "Someone will process this." Elena sat down, her hands clasped tight in her lap. Around her, the building hummed with quiet activity. Well-dressed people moved through the lobby with the kind of confidence that came from belonging in places like this. She felt like an imposter, like someone had made a mistake letting her through the door. Upstairs, in a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows, Raymond Blackwell was having what he considered a productive morning. He'd already reviewed and rejected 47 grant applications, approved 3 that met his strict criteria, and fired off a dozen emails before 9:30. Efficiency was his specialty. It was how he'd built his tech company from nothing into a billion-dollar empire before he turned 40. Now at 43, Raymond ran the Blackwell Foundation, which funded various causes around the city. Or rather, it existed mostly to make his company look good and provide some tax benefits, though he'd never say that out loud. He preferred to think of himself as a realist. Money went to things that made sense, to projects with measurable outcomes and proven track records. His assistant, Jennifer, brought in another stack of applications just before lunch. "These are the last of them for the Rising Star sponsorships," she said, setting them on his desk. "Most are pretty standard. Conservatory students, young musicians with impressive resumes." Raymond nodded, already flipping through them with practiced speed. He could usually tell within 30 seconds whether an application was worth serious consideration. Good school? Check. Strong recommendations from recognized professionals? Check. History of awards and performances? Check. Then he reached Elena's application. He paused reading the opening paragraph of her essay. Then he read it again, a frown creasing his forehead. "Listen to this," he said to Jennifer, who was almost out the door. "This applicant says she didn't start playing piano until she was in her 20s. She works 2 jobs to afford lessons at a community center, and she wants us to sponsor her entry into Rising Stars." He looked up, waiting for Jennifer to share his disbelief. She shifted uncomfortably. "Well, maybe she's talented despite her late start," Jennifer offered carefully. Raymond let out a short laugh. It wasn't a warm sound. Talented. She'd be competing against people who've trained their entire lives, people who've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on education and instruments, people who've performed internationally. He shook his head, reaching for his red rejection stamp. This is exactly the kind of delusional thinking that wastes everyone's time. He brought the stamp down on her application with a decisive thud. Denied. The word stood out in bright red letters across the top of Elena's carefully written essay. Musical ability isn't something you just pick up in your spare time, Raymond continued, tossing the application into the rejection pile. It requires years of dedicated training, starting young when the brain is still developing. That's just biology. Facts don't care about anyone's feelings or dreams. Jennifer picked up the rejected applications to file them away. She'd worked for Raymond for 3 years and had learned not to argue with him. He was brilliant in many ways, but he had a blind spot when it came to anything that didn't fit his logical, orderly view of the world. What's the point of encouraging false hope? Raymond said almost to himself now. I'd be doing her a favor by rejecting this. Better she focuses her energy on realistic goals. He moved on to the next application without another thought. His mind already calculating, measuring, dismissing. Downstairs, Elena still sat in the lobby. 2 hours had passed. Other people had come and gone, but she stayed, hoping to maybe speak with someone to explain in person what her essay might not have fully captured. She wanted to tell them about the first time she heard Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, how it made her cry on a bus ride home from work. She wanted to explain that music felt like the thing she'd been searching for her whole life without knowing it. But the receptionist never called her name. The afternoon light began to slant through the tall windows, and Elena finally stood up, her legs stiff from sitting so long. She'd find another way. She had to. The competition registration deadline was in 3 weeks, and without the grant, she'd barely be able to afford the entry fee, let alone the professional recording and formal attire that competitors were expected to have. But she'd figure something out. She always did. As Elena pushed through the heavy doors back into the busy street, Raymond was upstairs closing out his day, satisfied with his efficiency. He'd cleared his desk, made good decisions, kept his foundation's money away from wasteful ventures. He had no idea that in 3 weeks, he would meet the woman whose dream he'd dismissed with such certainty, and he had no idea that she would change everything he thought he knew about talent, about worth, and about what it really meant to deserve a chance. 3 weeks had crawled by since Elena submitted her application, and she still hadn't heard anything back. Deep down, she knew what that silence meant. She'd been rejected before plenty of times, but this one stung differently. This had been her best shot at making the Rising Stars competition a reality. Still, she'd scraped together enough money for the basic entry fee. She sold her laptop, picked up extra shifts, and even played piano at a small cafe on weekends for tips. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get her name on the competitor list. She'd figure out the rest somehow. Maybe she could borrow a decent dress. Maybe the judges wouldn't care that she didn't have a professionally produced audition recording like everyone else. Tonight, though, she wasn't thinking about any of that. Tonight, she was just trying to get through her shift at the Meridian Hotel, where a big charity gala was happening in the grand ballroom. The event was connected to the Rising Stars competition, a pre-celebration for all the donors and sponsors who made the whole thing possible. Elena moved through the crowd carrying a tray of champagne glasses, her feet already aching in the cheap dress shoes she'd worn for the past 2 years. The ballroom was stunning, with gold accents everywhere and a live string quartet playing softly in the corner. Everyone here wore clothes that cost more than she made in a month, maybe 2 months. She recognized a few faces from their photos in the business section of newspapers. Tech executives, real estate developers, people whose donations could change lives with a single signature. These were the people who decided which dreams deserved funding and which ones didn't. "Excuse me, miss," a woman in a glittering blue gown said, snapping her fingers to get Elena's attention. "Could you bring more of those little pastries? The ones with the cheese?" Elena nodded with a polite smile and headed back toward the kitchen. This was the part of the job she'd never gotten used to, being invisible until someone needed something. But she reminded herself why she was doing this. Every shift brought her a little closer to her goal. When she returned with a fresh tray, she passed by a table near the tall windows, where a group of men in expensive suits were laughing loudly. One voice rose above the others, confident and carrying. I'm telling you, the applications we get are absolutely ridiculous sometimes, the man said. Elena glanced over and felt her stomach drop. She recognized him instantly from the photos on the Blackwell Foundation website. Raymond Blackwell himself, the man who'd probably stamped denied on her application without a second thought. She should have kept walking. Should have pretended she hadn't heard anything. But her feet seemed to root themselves to the carpet. Just last month, Raymond continued, clearly enjoying his story, we had someone apply who didn't even start playing piano until their 20s. A waitress, I think.
Can you imagine?
Wanting to compete at Rising Stars against people who've trained since childhood? He shook his head, taking a sip of his wine. The delusion was remarkable. I almost felt bad, but honestly, someone needs to tell these people to be realistic. The men at his table chuckled, and one of them said something Elena couldn't quite hear. But Raymond's response came through crystal clear. I'm doing them a favor, really. False hope is crueler than honest rejection. Better they focus on achievable goals instead of wasting years chasing impossible fantasies. Elena's hands tightened around her tray. The champagne glasses rattled slightly, and she had to concentrate to keep them steady. Heat rushed to her face, a mixture of embarrassment and anger that made her vision blur at the edges. She thought about walking away, about being professional, about needing this job. But then she thought about every morning she'd woken up at 5 to practice before her shift. Every blister on her fingers from playing until they bled. Every single person who'd told her she was too old, too poor, too unprepared to pursue music seriously. And she thought about how this man, this stranger who knew nothing about her, had dismissed her entire life's dream in the time it took to lift a rubber stamp. Elena set down her tray on a nearby service table and walked directly to Raymond's table. Her supervisor would probably kill her for this, but she was past caring. Excuse me, Mr. Blackwell, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. Raymond looked up, mildly surprised that a server was addressing him directly. His eyes flickered with brief annoyance before settling into polite confusion. Yes, is there something you need? I need to tell you that you're wrong, Elena said. The words came out before she could stop them, and once they started, they kept coming. You just described my application. I am the delusional waitress you were laughing about. The table went silent. Raymond's expression shifted from confusion to recognition, then to something harder to read. His colleagues exchanged uncomfortable glances. I see, Raymond said slowly, leaning back in his chair. His face gave away nothing now, all business and control. And you thought interrupting a private conversation was appropriate? I thought being honest was appropriate, Elena replied. You clearly believe dreams have a price tag. That only people with money and early training deserve a chance to pursue what they love. But you're wrong about me. And you're wrong about what talent really means. One of Raymond's colleagues cleared his throat. Perhaps we should... But Raymond held up a hand, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. Something flickered there. Something that might have been curiosity or might have been the calculation of a man who just found an interesting challenge. You have courage. I'll give you that, Raymond said. Though courage without skill is just noise. He paused, and a slow smile spread across his face. It wasn't a kind smile. Tell me something. Are you actually competing in Rising Stars, or did my rejection stop you? I'm competing, Elena said, lifting her chin. I found another way. Interesting. Raymond set down his wine glass with deliberate care. The room seemed to lean in, sensing something was about to happen. Then let's make this more engaging, shall we? Rising Stars has an open preliminary round tomorrow evening. Anyone can perform. No fancy recordings required, no formal sponsors needed. Just walk in and play. Elena's supervisor had appeared at the edge of the room, her face pale with worry, but Elena couldn't look away from Raymond. Here's my proposal, Raymond continued, his voice carrying across nearby tables now. Other guests were starting to pay attention, conversations fading as they sensed drama unfolding. You perform tomorrow at the open call. If you can actually play well enough to impress the preliminary judges and move forward in the competition, I'll personally fund not just your entry, but a full year of training at any music school you choose, anywhere in the world. He paused, letting that sink in. It was more money than Elena could imagine, the kind of opportunity that could change everything. But, Raymond added, and there was steel in his voice now, when you fail to advance past the preliminaries, you'll do something for me. You'll stand up in front of all these people and admit that some dreams are simply unrealistic. That passion without proper foundation is just wishful thinking. You'll stop wasting people's time, including your own, on impossible pursuits. The room had gone completely quiet now. Elena felt everyone's eyes on her. Her supervisor was frantically gesturing for her to stop, to apologize, to back away from this situation before it destroyed her. But Elena thought about the piano in the community center basement, about Mrs. Chen's patient teaching and her own hands learning to dance across keys that had once felt foreign and impossible. She thought about the feeling that flooded through her when she played, like finally finding a home she'd been searching for her entire life. "I accept," Elena said quietly. Raymond stood up, extending his hand across the table. His grip was firm and cold when she shook it. "Tomorrow evening, then. 7 o'clock at Grandmont Hall. I'll make sure the judges know to watch for you." His smile sharpened. "I'll even invite some colleagues to witness what happens when reality meets delusion." Elena pulled her hand back, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd just agreed to humiliate herself in front of the city's elite if things went wrong, but she'd also just earned a chance she'd never have gotten otherwise. As she turned to leave, Raymond called after her. "What's your name?" "I should know who I'm sponsoring." "Elena Vasquez," she said without looking back. "Remember it." She walked out of the ballroom with her head high, even though her hands were shaking. Behind her, the room erupted in whispered conversations. Her supervisor would be furious. She might lose her job over this, but tomorrow night, she'd sit at that piano and show Raymond Blackwell exactly what impossible looked like when someone refused to stop reaching for it. Elena didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Raymond Blackwell's cold smile and heard her own voice saying, "I accept." What had she been thinking? She just bet everything on a single performance in front of judges who'd probably already decided she didn't belong there. At 4 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and went to the community center. She'd called in sick to both her jobs, which meant no pay today. But that was the least of her worries now. The building was locked, but she had a key that Mrs. Chen had given her months ago for early morning practice sessions. The basement was cold and smelled faintly of mildew, but Elena barely noticed. She sat at the old upright piano, the same one where she'd learned her first scales 4 years ago. Some of the keys stuck a little, and it hadn't been tuned in who knows how long, but it was hers in all the ways that mattered. She'd chosen her piece weeks ago, back when she still thought she might get the foundation grant. Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor. It was ambitious, maybe too ambitious. The piece demanded technical precision and emotional depth that usually came from years of formal training. Mrs. Chen had raised her eyebrows when Elena first suggested it. "That's a challenging choice," Mrs. Chen had said carefully. "Beautiful but unforgiving. Every mistake will show." "I know," Elena had replied, "but it's the piece that made me want to play piano in the first place." She'd heard it on a documentary about classical music, playing in the background while the narrator talked about something else entirely. But Elena had stopped hearing the words. The music had wrapped around her like a wave, pulling her under into something dark and beautiful and desperately sad. She'd looked up the piece that same night, listened to it 17 times in a row, and decided that someday, somehow, she would learn to play it. Now her fingers moved through the opening chords, those famous bells that announced the piece like a warning. She played it over and over, feeling for the right weight, the right timing. Her hands were tired from last night's shift, and they protested at first, but gradually they warmed up and remembered what to do. Hours passed. The sun rose, sending thin light through the basement windows. Elena played until her fingers ached and her back screamed from hunching over the keys. She played the difficult middle section 50 times, where the melody climbed and fell like someone crying out in desperation. She played the ending until she could feel the resolution in her bones, that final quiet moment of acceptance after all the storm and struggle. Around noon, Mrs. Chen appeared at the top of the basement stairs. She was 78 years old and moved slowly, but her eyes were sharp as ever. She didn't say anything at first, just listened to Elena play through the piece one more time. When Elena finished, Mrs. Chen came down the stairs and sat on the bench beside her. "I heard about last night," she said. "Mrs. Park from the restaurant called me. She was working the gala too." Elena closed her eyes. "I was stupid. I let him get under my skin." "Maybe," Mrs. Chen said. "Or maybe you were brave. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference." She placed her weathered hand over Elena's. Are you ready for tonight? No, Elena admitted. I'm terrified. What if I freeze up? What if my fingers don't cooperate? What if he's right and I've been delusional this whole time? Mrs. Chen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, let me tell you something. I played professionally for 30 years. Concert halls, recordings, the whole thing. And you know what I learned? Technical perfection is easy to find. Real music, the kind that makes people feel something. That's rare. You have that, Elena. Don't let anyone make you forget it. Elena felt tears prick her eyes. But what if it's not enough? Then it's not enough, Mrs. Chen said simply. But you'll know you tried. And that man, that Raymond Blackwell, he'll know he was wrong about you even if he never admits it. She stood up, her knees cracking. Now play it for me one more time. And this time, don't think about the judges or the bet or anything else. Just play for yourself. Elena took a deep breath and began again. This time she let herself feel the music instead of just executing it. She thought about every hard moment that had brought her to this piano. Every double shift. Every time someone had told her she was wasting her time. Every morning she'd chosen practice over sleep. All of it poured into the keys, turning into something bigger than just notes on a page. When she finished, Mrs. Chen had tears in her eyes. That, she said, that's what you play tonight. The afternoon dragged by in a blur. Elena went home to her tiny apartment and tried to figure out what to wear. She didn't own anything appropriate for performing at Grandmont Hall. Her nicest outfit was the black pants and white shirt from her waitressing uniform, and she couldn't exactly wear that after last night. She pulled out every piece of clothing she owned and spread them across her bed. Nothing looked right. Everything was too casual or too worn or too obviously cheap. Finally, she settled on a simple navy dress she'd bought at a thrift store 2 years ago. It was plain but clean, and at least it didn't have any visible stains or tears. At 5:30, she caught the bus toward Grandmont Hall. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She kept running through the piece in her mind, her fingers twitching slightly with each imagined phrase. Meanwhile, across town, Raymond was getting ready for what he considered an entertaining evening. He'd invited 6 colleagues from various companies, people who shared his views on practical philanthropy and realistic goal setting. They were meeting for dinner first, then heading to the hall to watch the preliminary auditions. This should be enlightening, Raymond told them over appetizers. A real-world example of why we have to be selective with our funding. Passion is admirable, but it's not enough. Never has been. His friend David, who ran a venture capital firm, nodded in agreement. Exactly. I see it all the time. People with big dreams but no foundation to build on. You're doing her a favor, honestly. Better to learn the hard truth now than waste more years. But Jennifer, Raymond's assistant, who'd been invited somewhat reluctantly, stayed quiet. She'd looked up Elena Vasquez after the gala incident, watched some shaky phone videos of her playing at a small cafe. There was something there. Something Jennifer couldn't quite put into words, but she knew Raymond well enough not to argue with him when his mind was made up. By 6:30, they were all seated in the observation section of Grandmont Hall, a special area where sponsors and VIPs could watch auditions without being visible to the performers. The preliminary round was starting, and young musicians filed in one by one, each carrying their instruments or sheet music like precious cargo. Raymond watched with the detached interest of someone observing a business process. He made mental notes about each performance: technically proficient but forgettable, good but not great, impressive credentials, but the performance didn't match the resume. An hour passed, then another. Elena's name wasn't called. Raymond checked his watch, wondering if she'd lost her nerve. Part of him almost hoped she had. It would prove his point without the messiness of public failure. But another part of him, a part he didn't quite understand, felt something like disappointment at the thought. At 8:15, the audition coordinator announced, "Last performer of the evening, Elena Vasquez." Raymond sat up straighter. His colleagues leaned forward with interest. They'd all heard the story by now, and they were curious to see how this would play out. The stage door opened and Elena walked out. She was wearing that simple navy dress, and she came straight from her shift at the diner because she'd worked until the last possible moment to make up for calling in sick yesterday. Her hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she carried no fancy leather folder of sheet music, just herself and the music in her head. Raymond noticed other people in the observation area whispering and pointing. Word had spread about the bet, apparently. Great. More witnesses to what he was certain would be a regrettable but necessary lesson. Elena walked to the piano like she was approaching something sacred. She didn't look at the judges or the observation area. She simply sat down, adjusted the bench slightly, and placed her hands on the keys. The room went completely still, and then she began to play, and Raymond felt something shift in his chest, something he couldn't name and didn't want to acknowledge, because what came from that piano wasn't just music. It was something else entirely, something that made his carefully constructed certainties feel suddenly fragile, like ice beginning to crack beneath his feet. The first notes came out soft, almost hesitant, like someone testing the water before diving in. Those famous opening chords of Rachmaninoff's Prelude, the ones that sounded like bells echoing across a frozen landscape. Elena's hands moved with careful precision, and for a moment Raymond allowed himself a small smile. Careful wasn't memorable. Careful was exactly what he'd expected from someone out of their depth. But then something changed. The music began to build, and with it came something Raymond hadn't anticipated. Elena wasn't just playing the notes correctly. She was living inside them. Her whole body swayed slightly with the rhythm, and her face held an expression of such complete absorption that it was almost uncomfortable to watch, like witnessing something private, something that shouldn't be shared with strangers. The melody climbed higher, the left hand rumbling with dark, heavy chords while the right hand sang out a line that sounded like someone crying for help. And Elena played it with the kind of raw emotion that you couldn't learn from any textbook or teacher. This was the sound of someone who understood struggle, who knew what it meant to reach for something that felt impossibly far away. Raymond found himself leaning forward without meaning to. Around him, his colleagues had gone completely silent. Even David, who'd been checking his phone throughout most of the other performances, had put it away and was staring at the stage. The piece moved into its middle section, technically the most demanding part. This was where Elena's lack of formal training should have shown itself clearly. The notes came faster, jumping across the keyboard in patterns that required years of practice to execute cleanly. Raymond waited for the mistakes, the hesitations that would prove his point. They didn't come. Oh, Elena's technique wasn't perfect. A few notes didn't ring out quite as clearly as they would from a conservatory student. Her hand position wasn't textbook. But somehow none of that mattered because the feeling behind the music was so powerful. It made those small imperfections invisible. She played like someone who had earned every single note, who had fought for the right to sit at that piano. In the judges section, 3 evaluators sat with their score sheets. The head judge, Professor Lin, had been teaching at the city's most prestigious music school for 30 years. She'd heard thousands of performances, maybe tens of thousands. She could spot technical flaws in an instant, and she had little patience for performers who relied on emotion to cover up sloppy preparation. But as she listened to Elena play, Professor Lin found herself setting down her pen. She'd been ready to mark the usual notes about hand position and pedal use and dynamic control. Instead, she just listened. Because what this young woman was doing up there was reminding her of something she'd almost forgotten. The reason she'd fallen in love with music in the first place. Before it became about grades and competitions and perfect execution. The second judge, a concert pianist named Thomas who performed internationally, had his eyes closed. He was thinking about his own journey, how his parents had paid for the best teachers money could buy, how he'd never had to choose between practice time and paying rent. He'd always had talent, sure, but he'd also had every advantage. And yet, listening to this performance, he wondered if somewhere along the way he'd lost something this waitress still had, something real. The third judge was younger, a violinist named Kara who'd won the Rising Stars competition herself 5 years ago. She was supposed to be the tough one, the judge who held everyone to the highest standards. She'd already failed 6 performers tonight for minor technical issues. But watching Elena play, she felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. On stage, Elena was nearing the piece's climax. This was the section she'd practiced hundreds of times in the community center basement, the part where everything came together in a massive surge of sound. Her fingers flew across the keys, pulling out chords that seemed to shake the air itself. The music was huge now, overwhelming, like a wave that had been building for miles finally crashing against the shore. And then, just as suddenly, it began to quiet down. The storm passed. The melody became simpler, gentler, as if all that struggle and passion had finally found some kind of peace. Elena played these final phrases with such tenderness it almost hurt to hear. Her shoulders relaxed, her face softened, and for a moment she looked like someone saying goodbye to something they loved. The last chord hung in the air, sustained by the pedal gradually fading into silence. Nobody moved. The quiet stretched for what felt like forever. Elena sat frozen at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys, suddenly aware of where she was and what she'd just done. Had it been enough? Had she made a complete fool of herself? She couldn't tell. She couldn't read the silence. Then Professor Lin started clapping. It began as slow, deliberate applause, the kind that carries weight. Thomas joined in immediately, and then Kara. Within seconds, other people in the hall were standing up, adding their applause to the wave of sound. In the observation area, Raymond sat completely still. His hands were gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He felt like someone had just punched him in the chest and stolen all his air. Everything he'd been so certain about felt suddenly shaky, uncertain. Jennifer, sitting beside him, had tears running down her face. She didn't even try to hide them. "Raymond," she whispered, "did you hear that?" He had, that was the problem. He'd heard it, really heard it, and now he couldn't unhear it. Couldn't go back to believing what he'd believed so confidently just an hour ago. David cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well," he said, trying to sound casual, "that was certainly interesting." But his voice lacked conviction. They'd all felt it. That thing Elena had created with just her hands and an instrument, and her absolute refusal to give up on what she loved. On stage, Elena finally stood up from the piano bench. Her legs felt weak and she wasn't entirely sure she could walk without falling, but she managed to give a small bow toward the judges' area before turning to leave the stage. Professor Lin picked up her score sheet and made a single, decisive mark. Then she passed it to Thomas, who nodded and marked his own sheet the same way. Kara added her mark without hesitation. All three sheets showed the same thing. Advanced to finals. The coordinator came out to announce the decision, and when Elena heard the words, she had to grab the edge of the stage curtain to keep herself upright. She'd done it. Actually done it. She'd proven that Raymond Blackwell was wrong, that his rejection letter and his dismissive laughter and his cruel bet had all been based on nothing but assumptions. Raymond stood up abruptly, making his colleagues jump. "I need some air," he muttered, and walked out of the observation area before anyone could respond. He found himself in the grand lobby of Grandmont Hall, pacing back and forth across the marble floor. His mind was racing, trying to organize his thoughts, trying to fit what had just happened into his understanding of how the world worked. The foundation of his beliefs had always been simple. Success came from resources and early training and the right opportunities. People who started late, who didn't have advantages. They were playing a game they couldn't win. It wasn't mean to say that. It was just realistic. Just true, except he'd just watched someone prove that his truth wasn't quite as solid as he'd thought. The door behind him opened, and Jennifer stepped out. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there giving him space to process whatever he was processing. Finally, Raymond spoke. "I was wrong." The words felt strange in his mouth, unfamiliar. Not just about her, about everything. "I know," Jennifer said gently. "She shouldn't have been that good. It doesn't make sense. She had every disadvantage, every reason to fail." He stopped pacing and looked at Jennifer, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked genuinely lost. "How did I miss it? How did I look at her application and see nothing worth supporting?" "Because you were looking at the wrong things," Jennifer said. "You were measuring credentials and training and background. You weren't measuring heart." Raymond laughed, but it was a hollow sound. "Heart, that's not a metric. That's not something you can quantify or predict." "No," Jennifer agreed. "It's not. Maybe that's the point." Inside the hall, the evening was wrapping up. The coordinator was announcing which performers would advance to the final round in 2 weeks. Elena's name was called third, and when she heard it, she thought about calling Mrs. Chen, about running through the streets shouting with joy, about all the impossible things that suddenly felt possible. But first she had to face Raymond Blackwell. She'd won the bet, which meant he owed her an apology and a year of funding. Part of her wanted to savor that victory. to make him squirm a little after everything he'd put her through. But another part of her, the part that had just poured her whole heart into that piano performance, felt something different, something that surprised her. She felt sorry for him, sorry that he'd built his whole life around being right, around calculating and measuring and controlling everything. Sorry that he'd almost missed the chance to see that some of the best things in life couldn't be predicted or planned. They could only be felt. Elena walked out into the lobby, still wearing her simple navy dress, still looking like someone who didn't quite belong in a place this fancy. She saw Raymond standing by the windows with Jennifer, and she walked toward them with steady steps. Raymond turned when he heard her approach. Their eyes met, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. All the words from their last encounter seemed to hang in the air between them, sharp and waiting. Elena stopped a few feet away from Raymond, her heart still pounding from the performance and from what she was about to do. She'd imagined this moment 100 times during the past 24 hours. In her head, she'd been righteous and angry, forcing him to admit he was wrong in front of everyone, making him feel as small as he'd tried to make her feel. But now, looking at his face, she saw something she hadn't expected. He looked genuinely shaken, like someone who'd just watched the ground open up beneath his feet. His expensive suit was slightly rumpled, his usually perfect hair messed up from running his hands through it. He looked human in a way he hadn't at the gala. "You won?" Raymond said before she could speak. His voice was quiet, stripped of all that confident superiority from before. "The bet. You won it fairly," Elena nodded slowly. "I did." "I owe you an apology," he continued, the words clearly difficult for him. "And funding. A year of training anywhere you choose. I'll honor that." He paused, seeming to struggle with something. "But I need you to know that the apology isn't just because I lost a bet. It's because I was genuinely, completely wrong about you." Jennifer excused herself quietly, sensing this was a conversation that needed to happen without witnesses. Elena and Raymond stood in the empty lobby, the sound of the string quartet still drifting faintly from the hall. "You were wrong about more than just me," Elena said. "You were wrong about what matters, about who deserves chances." Raymond nodded, looking down at his hands. "I know. I've spent my whole life believing success was a formula. Right background plus right training plus right resources equals results. I built a fortune on that belief. Built my entire worldview on it." He looked up at her. "And then you walked on that stage and proved that everything I thought I knew was incomplete at best, completely wrong at worst." "I'm not saying resources don't matter," Elena said carefully. "If I'd had money for better training, better instruments, more time to practice, I'd be even better than I am now. But you assumed that because I didn't have those things, I had nothing, that I was wasting everyone's time even trying." "I did," Raymond admitted. "And I probably wasn't just wrong about you. How many other applications did I reject without really seeing the person behind them? How many other dreams did I dismiss because they didn't fit my narrow definition of what was possible?" The question hung in the air between them. Elena could see he was really grappling with it, that this wasn't just about saving face or honoring a bet. Something had genuinely shifted inside him. "So what happens now?" Elena asked. Raymond took a deep breath. "Now I keep my promise. Full funding for a year of training. And I'd like to do more than that if you'll let me. I want to change how the foundation works. I want to start looking at applications differently. Funding people based on passion and potential instead of just credentials and backgrounds." Elena studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity, but all she saw was someone who'd had their world turned upside down and was trying to figure out how to stand in this new reality. "That sounds good," she said, "but it can't just be words. It has to be real." "I know," Raymond said, "and I want you to help me. Not just as someone I'm funding, but as someone who can teach me to see what I've been missing. Will you consider it?" Elena thought about it. Part of her wanted to just take the funding and walk away to prove she didn't need anything else from him. But another part of her, the part that had always believed music could change people, recognized something important happening here. Raymond Blackwell wasn't just offering money. He was offering to change, to grow, to admit he'd been wrong. That was rarer than talent, rarer than skill. "Okay," she said, "but on one condition. You come to the finals. You watch everyone perform, not just me, and you really look at them. Try to see them the way you should have been seeing people all along." "I will," Raymond promised. "I'll be there." 2 weeks passed in a blur. Elena chose to train with Professor Lin, who offered to work with her personally after that preliminary performance. The funding from Raymond covered not just lessons but a practice space with a real grand piano, proper sheet music, even a decent concert dress for the finals. But Elena insisted on keeping her job at the diner. She cut back her hours, but she didn't quit. When Raymond asked her why, she said simply, "Because I never want to forget what it felt like to work for every single thing I have. That struggle made my music real. I'm not ready to let go of that yet." The night of the finals arrived and Grandmont Hall was packed. Elena performed 4th out of 8 competitors. She played a different piece this time, Chopin's Ballad No. 1, another ambitious choice. And once again, she poured everything she had into it. Every hope, every fear, every moment of doubt and determination. When the results came in, Elena placed 3rd. Not 1st, not 2nd, but 3rd. The winners were both incredible musicians with years more training than she had. And Elena found that she was okay with that, because 3rd place came with a small scholarship and, more importantly, with validation. She'd proven she belonged here, that she could compete, that her dream wasn't delusional after all. Raymond was in the audience, and when he came to congratulate her afterward, he was smiling. A real smile, not that cold, calculating expression from before. "3rd place," he said. "That's remarkable." "It's a start," Elena replied. "It's more than that," Raymond said. "It's proof that the system has been broken, and that we need to fix it. Jennifer and I have been working on something. A new grant program specifically for late-blooming artists, people who come to their passion later in life or from non-traditional backgrounds. We're calling it the Second Chance Arts Initiative." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. "Raymond, that's amazing. It was your idea, really," he said. "You showed me that talent doesn't have an age limit or a required background check. We've already got funding for 50 scholarships in the first year, and we're going to keep growing it." Over the next few months, Raymond transformed the Blackwell Foundation completely. He brought in new advisors, including Elena, who helped review applications with fresh eyes. He started funding artists, musicians, writers, and creators who'd been overlooked by traditional systems. People who worked 2 jobs and practiced in their spare time. People who'd started late but burned bright with passion and dedication. And he attended every performance he could, learning to see not just technical perfection but the human heart behind the art. He watched a 40-year-old father of 3 play guitar with calloused fingers that had spent years in construction. He listened to a grandmother who'd taken up painting after retirement, create works that galleries now wanted to show. He funded a young man who wrote poetry on his phone during night shifts as a security guard. Each story reminded Raymond of what he'd almost missed when he stamped "denied" on Elena's application. Each person reminded him that dreams didn't follow formulas or timelines or neat logical paths. Elena continued to grow as a musician. She performed at smaller venues around the city, building her reputation gradually. Professor Lin became not just her teacher but her mentor and friend. And yes, she eventually did perform at Carnegie Hall. 5 years later, as part of a showcase for non-traditional classical musicians, Raymond was in the audience that night too, sitting next to Mrs. Chen, who'd become something of a celebrity herself as the teacher who'd first recognized Elena's potential. When Elena walked on stage, she looked different than she had that first night at Grandmont Hall, more polished, more confident. But she still had that same quality, that raw emotional honesty that made her music feel alive. After the performance, at a small reception, Elena found Raymond standing by himself, looking thoughtful. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "I'm thinking about how close I came to never hearing you play," he said quietly. "How many other Elenas are out there right now, getting rejection letters from people like me, people who think they know what talent looks like but are really just protecting their own narrow view of the world?" "But you changed," Elena said. "That matters. Did I change enough, though?" Raymond wondered. "The foundation has helped hundreds of people now, but how many thousands did I turn away before you taught me to see differently?" Elena put her hand on his arm. "You can't fix the past. You can only do better going forward. And you are. You're creating opportunities for people who never would have gotten them otherwise. That's not nothing, Raymond. That's everything." He smiled at her, that genuine smile she'd come to know over the past few years. "You know what the funny thing is? I thought I was doing you a favor by rejecting you. I thought I was protecting you from disappointment. But you were the one doing me a favor. You saved me from living my whole life thinking I had everything figured out. We saved each other then, Elena said. You gave me resources to grow and I gave you a reason to change. That seems fair. As the reception continued around them, Elena thought about that night in the Grandmont Hall lobby when Raymond had first heard her play. She thought about how one performance, one moment of refusing to give up had changed not just her life, but his too, and through him hundreds of other lives. Dreams, she'd learned, were contagious. When you fought for yours loud enough and hard enough, other people started believing in theirs too. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, even the people who tried to stop you ended up becoming the ones who helped you fly. Raymond never forgot the lesson Elena taught him. Every time someone with an unusual application crossed his desk, he remembered that waitress with a dream and calloused hands who'd played like her life depended on it. Because it had. And because she'd refused to let anyone tell her it was impossible, she'd changed what was possible for everyone who came after her. That was the real performance, Elena realized. Not the one on stage, but the one she lived every day. The performance of showing up, of trying, of refusing to let other people's limitations become her own. And that was a performance that never really ended. It just kept going, one note at a time, building into something beautiful and true.